recording. Great. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us. Tonight's presentation, Confederacy, Civil War Monuments, and White Supremacy with Connor Towne O'Neill. We're joined tonight by author Connor Towne O'Neill for a presentation on his critically acclaimed debut book, Down Along with That Devil's Bones, A Reckoning with Monuments, Memory, and the Legacy of White Supremacy. Connor's journey onto the battlefield of white supremacy began with a visit to Selma, Alabama back in 2015. There, he had a chance encounter with a group of people preparing to erect a statue to celebrate the memory of Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the most notorious Confederate generals, a man who Union General William Tecumseh Sherman referred to that as that devil. After that day in Selma, Connor, a white northerner transplanted to the South, decided to dig deeply into the history of Forrest, who was a slave trader and the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, as well as other monuments to him throughout the South, which, like Confederate monuments across America, have now become flashpoints in the fight against racism. So Connor Towne O'Neill works as a producer on the NPR podcast White Lies, which was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in audio reporting. He lives in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and he teaches at Auburn University and with the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project. His writing has appeared in New York Magazine, Vulture, Slate, and elsewhere. And again, tonight's event is sponsored by the Corning Foundation and is presented in collaboration with the Libraries Working Towards Social Justice Partnership, specifically tonight, Andover, Lawrence, and Pepperell. So everyone who's watching live on Zoom and watching live on Facebook, and those that will watch later on demand on YouTube, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Connor for joining us here tonight. And Connor, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Robert. Thanks so much for putting this on and for having me, and thanks to everyone for being here. It really is my pleasure to join y'all tonight. So, as Robert mentioned in his introduction here, my journey here to this book started back in 2015, and more specifically on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma. And really, I think, it feels strange to say this. This is going on, it's been more than 6 years now, but really every day now, because the story has continued on even past the publication of this book, really for every day of the past 6 years, I've been chasing this story that I found in an old Southern cemetery. And it's a story of Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, although maybe more specifically, this is a story about his afterlife, the fights over the fates of his monuments, over what the life of this slave trader, this so-called Confederate military genius, an accused war criminal, and the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan should mean to Americans today. And I tried to get into that question about the meaning of his legacy by reporting on fights over four of his monuments that are across the Southeast. And so it's that story that I've been chasing for years now, and it's one that I literally stumbled onto while I was looking for free parking. And I was looking for free parking because I was in Selma, Alabama for the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday, you'll remember the attack by Alabama law enforcement on nonviolent civil rights protesters at the foot of Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge, the late John Lewis leading the line of demonstrators that morning. 50 years later, President Obama is in town. Along with him, some 40,000 other people show up. And if y'all have been to Selma, you know Selma's a small city. I mean, it sort of rides that kind of big town, small city line. And so 40,000 extra people show up. Parking, as you might imagine, is a nightmare. And I was a broke graduate student at the time. So I'm gonna look out for free parking wherever I can find it. And I've been to Selma for a little while. I've been to Selma a few times at that point. Because since moving to Alabama in 2013, I had originally grown up in Pennsylvania, but I had moved to Alabama in 2013 to go to graduate school. And like the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, it had been preceded by a number of these 50th anniversaries about the civil rights movement. It was very much sort of in the ether of the moment. The week that I moved to Tuscaloosa was the 50th anniversary of then Governor George Wallace's infamous stand in the schoolhouse door. My first week of classes at the University of Alabama marked the 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church up in Birmingham, act of terrorism that claimed the lives of 4 little girls. And so I really felt like I was being more than invited. Like I was sort of, the universe was sort of insisting that I try and make sense of my new home through the lens of the 50th anniversary of these flashpoints of racial violence in the movement. And so that's what I was doing. I met 2 other folks at the University of Alabama, Chip Brantley and Andrew Grace. And together, the 3 of us had begun reporting and researching a story that would become the NPR podcast, White Lies, which of course involved a murder just days after the Bloody Sunday attack in Selma. Okay, so with all of that in mind, with all of that sort of swirling in the culture in the moment, I show up in Selma. It's March of 2015. I'm desperate for free parking. And because I'd been to Selma a few times before doing research on this story, I knew Selma's one of these cities, like so many southern cities, that has one of these extensive cemeteries in it. Think Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, Spanish moss, live oak trees, mausoleums, and its own system of roads. And so I think, perfect. I'll stash my car over the cemetery. It's just a couple blocks down to the bridge. I'll listen to President Obama speak, and I'll continue this sojourn that I was on, trying to make sense of the present and of Alabama through the lens of the civil rights movement. But what I found when I pull into that cemetery is that if I wanted to make sense of any of this, I was going to have to go back another 100 years into the past. And that's because when I pull into the cemetery, I start seeing these signs. Confederate Memorial Circle closed, no trespassing, and a group of people sort of hovering around this section of the cemetery, arms crossed, kind of glaring at this car that has pulled up. And that sign, those glares, though intended, of course, to be off-putting and discouraging for a journalist, are just catnip, right? So I very credulously just kind of walk over and say, what are y'all doing here? This is the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday with neo-Confederates. Like, what is going on here? Come to learn, this group calls themselves the Friends of Forest, has spent really the better part of the last 2 decades fighting about this statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest that they had put up. And, common sense would tell you that putting up a statue of the first Grand Wizard of the Klan, Confederate general, slave trader, that's going to be controversial anywhere, right? But to do it in Selma, which is so synonymous with the civil rights movement, all the more of a controversy. But come to find, the Friends of Forest had originally put up this statue of Forrest on city property the same week that the city had inaugurated its first Black mayor back in 2000. So insult to injury, protests, debates, fighting, marches, everything you might imagine. Finally, the city strikes a compromise and moves the statue out to the cemetery. But then it's stolen. You see the image of the detective dusting for prints there. The statue gets stolen, but its theft only sparks more debate, more controversy, more marches, eventually a federal lawsuit that the Friends of Forest win. And by the time I meet them in 2015, they are fresh off of that win in federal court and are able to replace this statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And so they're out there that day. Well, in addition to, thumbing their nose at the civil rights anniversary that's happening all around them, they're out there that day to sort of ready the grounds for this rededication of the second statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest that they are about to put up. And I leave Confederate Memorial Circle that morning with a bunch of questions. Who, chief among them, as a Yankee who has, not particularly well versed in Civil War history at that point. Who is Nathan Bedford Forrest? But also, what does it mean to put up a Confederate statue? And what does it mean to put it up in 2015? What does it mean to do it in a city like Selma? So I had all of these questions that were weighing on me. And really, they were the spark for this book. The book is really trying to grapple with this. What is the meaning of what does it mean to remember someone like Forrest? How should he be remembered? What does it mean for these particular cities that there are these statues of this infamous Confederate general? So I leave the cemetery that morning, grappling with these questions, thinking, maybe there's a good essay here. But then two things happen in the wake of that 50th anniversary. The first is that the Friends of Forrest unveil their new statue. Forrest is back in Selma. 3 weeks later, Dylann Roof murders 9 Black Americans at Mother Emanuel AME Church in South Carolina. And after Roof is arrested, it emerges that before he headed for the church in Charleston, Roof had taken a sort of strange sightseeing tour across South Carolina, going to cemeteries, slave memorials, plantations, Civil War battlefields, almost as a way to sort of steel himself for the act of terrorism that he was about to commit. And so, in the wake of the Charleston 9 murders, as they would come to be known, this massive referendum on Confederate monuments, Confederate symbols breaks out. The most iconic image, I think, from the summer of 2015 is, of course, Bree Newsom Bass scaling the flagpole of the Capitol, the state capitol in South Carolina, to remove the Confederate flag that had flown there for some 50 years at that point. Not 150 years, but 100 years, but 50 years. And that the spectacle of that, the power of that act of protest on Newsom Bass's part, inspired people across the country, and more than inspired, really sensitized them to these names, symbols, flags, statues that were all around them, and beyond the Southeast too. Confederate monuments in Montana, Confederate monuments in Los Angeles. It was really a nationwide reckoning with these symbols of the traitorous Confederate Army fighting in explicit terms to maintain and expand slavery. And what is, I think, so interesting is that they've been there, right? These monuments in particular have been around us, sort of, as one person put it to me, the sort of water that we've been swimming in. But that the Charleston 9 murders and then Bree Newsom Bass's, symbolic removal of that flag in South Carolina, I think sensitized a lot of people to these statues that were everywhere, and not just called their attention to them, but asked them to connect those symbols, those honorifics, those statues, literally putting these people on pedestals, to ask them to connect those symbols to broader, deeper, more structural inequities regarding race in this country. And I think that we're still feeling the power of that. We're still living in the ripples of that. I mean, the summer of 2020, the sort of season of the toppled monument, over 100 Confederate monuments have been removed since then. So when something like the murder of George Floyd happened, so many people know where to go to express their grief, their rage, their protest. They congregate around symbols, monuments of the people who epitomize and embody these racist ideas. And I think there's a power in that, and it shouldn't go unsaid, the importance of that kind of grassroots organizing and protest work, like people such as Bree Newsome Bass. And we're looking at a slide right now of a great collection of photographs from Lee Friedlander published in the 1970s. It's called The American Monument. And the sort of visual joke of this book by Friedlander is that it's about American monuments, but they're always in the background or obscured or surrounded by all of the other clutter that exists in American cities now, as if to say, like, we have all of this public history, but its meaning is kind of lost on us, and our attention has waned. We've sort of gone blind to them. But what's been, I think, really incredible to watch over the last several years, as I've been working on this book, and broader things in the culture have been happening as well, is that those statues have racked into focus. Like, they are foreground. We notice them and notice and ask questions of them. What do they mean? Who is being remembered? What is being forgotten? And I think that's been, obviously I'm biased, I wrote a book about it, but I think that's been really powerful. And so back to 2015, in the wake of the Charleston 9 murders and Bree Newsome Bass's protests, this referendum breaks out across the country. Protest movements in cities and towns, school districts, to reckon with how this country remembers the Civil War, and how it remembers and continues to honor the Confederacy. And so, because I had this very strange encounter with the Friends of Forest back in Selma just months earlier, I started following protest campaigns aimed at forest monuments in particular. And because it turns out there's way more than just that statue in Selma. There's a county named after Forrest in Mississippi, a city named after him in Arkansas, a state park in Tennessee. And Tennessee is really a doozy. There are more markers of Forrest than there are in that state to the 3 men who would become president from Tennessee. So it gives you a sense of who is sort of top of mind when the state of Tennessee wants to do some public history. It's Forrest and not, Polk or Johnson or Jackson. As I think I mentioned this before, but as Madison Smart Bell, the terrific novelist who wrote a great novel about Forrest called Devil's Dream, as he said to me when I interviewed him about his book, he said, growing up in Middle Tennessee, Forrest was just the water that you swam in. He is sort of everywhere. So there were plenty of protest movements aimed specifically at Forrest to focus on. There was no shortage of monuments, no shortage of protest movement. But I ended up following four cities, 4 monuments, 4 protest campaigns in particular. In Selma, of course, because it was the inciting incident for all of this. And then in Memphis, where a 30-foot equestrian bronze statue of Forrest stood. He and his wife were actually, when the statue went up, he and his wife were disinterred from their graves in a cemetery and moved to be buried under this statue. And there was a massive campaign, a series of campaigns. It's been decades in the making to try and remove that statue in Memphis. There's also this hideous sort of cartoonish statue of Forrest on the roadside of the Interstate I-65 in Nashville. And then a building on campus at Middle Tennessee State University named after Forrest, and students on campus in 2015 and 2016 directly citing Bree Newsome Bass were inspired to start a protest movement to try and campaign to change the name of Forrest Hall. So the book is in 4 parts. It's in these 4 different cities: Selma, Murfreesboro, Nashville, and Memphis. And it follows the campaigns to try and remove these statues, talk to the folks who put them up or who are fighting to keep them up. And really through it, I came to see what I started to call a cold civil war in the making. These differences in our understanding of the past, what that past should mean to us in the present, who controls that past, whose stories get told, who controls who tells those stories. All I came to find shifted on these ideas of white supremacy that are really, really embedded in so many different aspects of American life. First and foremost, though, is how we're taught to think about our history, and how long after emancipation, policies and ideologies have maintained to maintain a racial hierarchy. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the book: 4 cities, 4 monuments, 4 campaigns to take aim at monuments of Nathan Bedford Forrest. With it, though, of course, there's a blend of history. It's sort of a slanted biography of Forrest in some ways, delving into his life as it intersects with these 4 different cities. But it's also personal too. So it's this blend of history, of journalism, but also of personal essay. Because what I came to find as I was digging into these stories is that I couldn't be in a, quote unquote, objective, neutral reporter, because so much of what I found in these stories, I felt like was implicating me. Not as a sort of measure of what's in my heart. I try to be a upstanding, empathic, anti-racist liberal. But even so, what I was found is that the lines that my life has moved on, how my parents were able to buy a house, where they were able to buy that house, what school I was able to go to because they were in that house, how that school saw me, thought of me, forgived my trespasses, literally in some cases, how I was treated by police, the schools that I was able to go to for higher education on, the cosign from parents who were, putting up their house as an asset. So just all of these structural ways that have built the foundations of my life were really turning on racial inequities, right? These were the opportunities that I've been able to avail myself of and have led me to be able to write a book like this in the first place, were afforded to me, whether I liked it or not, whether I agreed with it or not, were built in no small part because of these, frankly, psychotic notions of race that America has. So I felt called to sort of grapple with these issues of whiteness, of white supremacy, that go beyond a sort of evaluation of what's in one individual's heart, and more to the structures that who benefits from them and who is punished by them. Or loses out to them. So it's a personal reckoning as well as it is a piece of reporting and also a piece of history. So it's a weird sort of hybrid book, but I found that each of those different disciplines, or each of those different approaches to the material, really started to inform the others. The fact that I was on this sort of personal reckoning, coming into a consciousness, naive as it sounds, coming into a personal consciousness, a growing personal consciousness of how race operates in this country, I think improved my reporting. In some ways, it allowed me to talk to people who wouldn't otherwise talk to me. The mayor of Selma, who it was this meant to be this moment of triumph when he was elected, the first Black mayor of the city that gave the world the vote, has a statue of Forrest put up that same week. It was upsetting for him, and I think in some ways, he's still not over the fact that, understandably so, not over the fact that that's happened. And I tried for a long time to get him to talk to me, and he wouldn't talk to me until I was able to really talk to him about what this story meant to me, but how I was implicated in it. Because I think he was wary of one more person doing a story about the spectacle of it. Oh, a statue of the Klan goes up the same week the Black mayor gets elected. I think he wanted to know that I knew that this story was about me, that this story was about white Americans, and that if I didn't know that I had a place in this story and I couldn't talk with him about it, he wasn't going to waste his breath talking to me, because the point of the story, the meaning of this story, these ways that race is used to hoard access to resources, to wealth, to opportunities, while also meant to dehumanize and diminish and demean others. If I didn't understand my place in that story, the meaning of it would be lost on me. So that personal journey that I was on was impacting and shaping my reporting, and also I think sensitized me to the deeper issues of our history. The debates that we're having right now about the 1619 Project or critical race theory, I think are showing that I think some folks who want to sort of pull rank or claim a kind of prerogative for their history feel like that is under threat. In my reading, a more honest telling of American history is reaching more and more people, and conservatives are feeling protective of their version of events and defensive about it. And so we're trying to sort of lambast things like critical race theory. Anyway, so just a sense of the stakes of this debate. It's not history for history's sake, but history because it is shaping the present that we live in. How we understand our past inevitably determines how we understand our present. Okay, I'll talk for just a few more minutes here, going into maybe some more specifics about the different cities and monuments that I've reported on, but I'm eager to hear your questions and have more of a conversation. Let me just give you a little bit of info here. First, this is Forest Hall. This is what's on campus at Middle Tennessee State. Like I said, students there who started a Change the Name campaign, directly inspired by Bree Newsom Bass, launched this protest movement on campus, and the university did what I think a lot of universities do when faced with flashpoints like this. They started a task force, and they gave that task force three options. They said, you can make a recommendation to the university that we change the name, that we keep the name, or that we keep the name with so-called additional historical context. And so this task force of 13, 14 people, it took a year, and they had these open forums where students, faculty, folks in the broader Murfreesboro community could come and testify either in support of a change of name or to keep the name. And it became a kind of microcosm. This is like February 2016, right? Like the election is upon us. This sort of polarized debate in America found a kind of microcosm in Murfreesboro over the question of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And so they had these forums, people would get up, and it was structured in a tit for tat way. So someone would get up and would talk for 3 minutes about how great Nathan Bedford Forrest was. And then someone would get up and talk about how horrible he was. And then you go back and forth for hours. There were standoffs, there was reports of intimidation and threats of violence in the parking lot of these debates. Students protested and did walkouts. There was armed security in the venues. It was just this knockdown, drag out fight about whether the university should keep the name of Forest Hall or not. And actually, though students had turned pretty pessimistic about their prospects, the task force actually did recommend that they change the name. The president of the university agreed with them. The Board of Regents that oversees the public universities in Tennessee likewise agreed with them. And yet even that wasn't enough. There's a state law in Tennessee, the Heritage Protection Act, although sometimes jokingly referred to by journalists as the Nathan Bedford Forrest Protection Act, meant that any change to public memorials, including names of buildings, needed a 2/3 vote by the state's historical commission to remove to remove a statue or change a name. And the historical commission said no. So Forest Hall remains Forest Hall. Although in the past year, there's been another campaign amongst the current students there to try once more to change that name. The next section of the book goes, another hour up I-65 into South Nashville, where if you're northbound, look on your right and you'll see 13 Confederate flags flanking this monstrosity of a statue. A really just sort of comically awful depiction of Forrest on his horseback. It was sculpted by a man named Jack Kershaw, who the Southern Poverty Law Center, in an obituary for Kershaw when he died in 2010. I wasn't able to interview him, sadly. But when Kershaw died, the Southern Poverty Law Center called him one of the most notorious segregationists of the 20th century. And that's because, in addition to sculpting this late in life cartoon villain of Forrest, that he's 28 feet high, stuck right next to people's morning commutes in Nashville, Kershaw was also the leader of the statewide resistance to school integration in Tennessee in the 1950s. In the 1970s, he was James Earl Ray's lawyer, the man accused of assassinating Martin Luther King. And then in the 1990s, in addition to sculpting the statue, he founded a group known as the League of the South, a explicitly ethno-nationalist, white supremacist organization calling for another secession of the southern states, and was responsible for instigating a lot of the violence in Charlottesville in 2017. So as hideous and kind of comically awful as the statue is, the story of the sculptor, I think, really cuts a line through, decades of white supremacist organizing in Nashville. And I think he proved a really good lens through which to look at the city and the legacy of white supremacy in it. And then the book climaxes, as I've mentioned, this equestrian statue in Memphis. Like Forest Hall in Murfreesboro, this statue is protected by the Tennessee Heritage Protection Act. Twice the city of Memphis appealed to the Historical Commission to remove the statue, and twice the Historical Commission said no. And so, catching tailwind by a really intense, impassioned grassroots protest movement to remove the statue that gained a lot of tailwind after Unite the Right in 2017, the city of Memphis came up with a pretty clever sort of end run around this Heritage Protection Act. The act forbid the removal of monuments from public land, yes, but not from private land. And so what the city did is that they sold the park the statue was in to a county commissioner. And as soon as the ink was dry on the bill of sale, this county commissioner, a man named Van Turner, rolled in a crane and removed the statue. And there was this powerful, cathartic moment for a lot of the protesters who had spent years of their life working to get this statue down. You can see the straps of the crane there. They talked about how when it took hold, when the straps caught and the statue lifted off its pedestal, they talked about the weight being removed. Van Turner, this county commissioner who sort of spearheaded its removal, he talked about how he grew up in Memphis. His father grew up in Memphis. When his dad was a boy, it was illegal for him to walk through the park because it was a segregated park. And now he owned the park and was removing the Confederate monument that stood in it. Other protesters, organizers talked about how, the symbols matter, that being able to remove a symbol like this of a slave trader, the Grand Wizard of the Klan, being able to remove those kinds of statues really showed what was possible, what else is possible, how else, beyond symbolic equity, how else can we pursue equity? They sort of caught an inspiration from the statue's removal and were encouraged to keep working. Things like access to voting, equitable public education. So it was really not just a flashpoint, but more sort of tailwind for progressive activists in Memphis and in Tennessee to keep fighting for a more equal and just city. So a really powerful climax to the book. And so there you are, 4 cities, 4 monuments, 4 protest movements to try and remove them. And through it, I think, at least for me, a real insight into the manifold ways that white supremacy and our myopic understanding of American history continues to govern a lot of public life. So that's what I got. I could keep going. I could keep going for hours. I've got plenty of material, but I'm really curious to hear from you all. Questions that you have, or thoughts, observations, whatever you got. Let's talk.
Great. So folks, please start getting some questions into the chat for Connor. And we'll get started here. Francis asks, why doesn't the university just stop using the forest building? Just take everything out, close the doors, and let it rot.
Yeah, good question. I think that actually, Francis, there's some insight there. I think instead of continuing to fight, the university is just going to tear the building down. I think they maybe naively thought that they could have a sort of dispassionate debate about Forrest, but he's such an infamous figure. It's sort of impossible to talk about him in ways that don't become incredibly emotional and impassioned and accusatory to one side to the other. And so I think instead of I think they tried to do the right thing, and the historical commission foiled it. And so now I think the next easiest thing is to just knock the building down. It's not on the 5-year plan for the university. I haven't been able to confirm that its omission from that plan means that they are going to knock it down, but it does seem like all evidence points to the fact that maybe it's just easier to, as you say, just sort of close up shop and be done with it. So at least there, and Middle Tennessee State, it's the second biggest university in the state. It is made up, student population is 1/3 people of color. And it has a building named after the first Grand Wizard of the Klan on its campus. But maybe not for too much longer.
So Gail writes, thank you. Jamie asks, what was one of the most surprising things you learned when conducting research for your book?
One of the most surprising things. That's a good question. I mean, I think in some ways, I never got over that first encounter that launched this book. I admit that I went into that day pretty naive. And I think in some ways the personal section of this book is about, it's a sort of loss of innocence narrative about someone who learned a lot that maybe I should have known before about how race works in this country. But I was gobsmacked that there were neo-Confederates around for the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Like, I was being so pious and innocent, thinking like, oh, this really important moment, we need to go and we need to meditate on the sacrifice of these brave civil rights demonstrators. And then you see these folks waving Confederate flags and talking about how, the Klan wasn't really that bad. It was just, it boggled the mind. But everything about it was absurd. That they had put up this statue, not in 1866, but in 2000, and then we're going to do it again in 2015. Just the antagonism with which they spoke. The way that they tried to recruit me was also very surprising, although again, maybe shouldn't have been. I think they really saw sort of potential ally in me, I think just by virtue of my race. But they handed me all these propaganda pamphlets that they had and said, Forrest fought for you. Will you fight for him? There's also this long backstory with that section of the cemetery in Selma. It was actually built, that the project to build Confederate Memorial Circle in Selma was launched by a woman named Elodie Todd Dawson. And you hear Todd, right? And you think Mary Todd Lincoln, right? They were half sisters. So one of them marries the great emancipator, and the other marries a fire-breathing secessionist in Selma, and then spearheads what would become the UDC chapter, the United Daughters of the Confederacy chapter in Selma, and builds Confederate Memorial Circle. So, I mean, all of it is surprising. I would encourage everyone, in your first opportunity, please go to Selma. An amazing, powerful city full of history and surprising, strange things there.
So Connor, let me play devil's advocate, or let me. So, and this is just an exercise in maybe. I'm sure these are things that you've heard along the way, but let me throw out a couple of things that I hear from folks who support maintaining Confederate war statues.
Yeah.
So one argument I hear often is the slippery slope argument, where some of America's founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Andrew Jackson, were slaveholders. Should all their monuments come down as well? So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's important. It's important to distinguish history from a monument, right? Like monuments are about someone from history, but they're not in and of themselves a piece of history. They're an honorific, right? We're literally putting them on a pedestal and saying, "Remember this person." You sort of immortalize them in that way, and so it's hard to have nuance in a monument, right? Because it's so firmly in the context of honoring them. But because they're not history, if you take them down, you don't lose that history, right? That this statue of Forrest in Memphis is gone. And yet Forrest's life in Memphis still very much exists, and is there and can be learned from and documented and exists in the archives. But to the question, Jefferson, Washington, the slippery slope, I think it's okay. I think let's try the slippery slope. I don't think it's gotten too slippery yet. And that's not to say I think they're, categorically awful people, but I think what I mean when I say I welcome the slippery slope is that I welcome an expansion of the referendum on historical figures that we've so far seen most acutely with folks from the Confederacy, like Forrest, like Robert E. Lee. We really have had a pretty good moment of public history in which more and more people are able to have come to an understanding about why the Confederacy was bad, and to a certain degree how the kinds of white supremacist policies that the Confederacy was pursuing have lived long after the Civil War. The ways that we've sort of created this racial hierarchy has persisted and still continues to exist in housing, in education. We have a 10-to-1 racial wealth gap in this country. So I think that referendum hasn't been slippery yet. I think it's been mostly good as it pertains to the Confederacy. If we were to have that referendum on the founding fathers too, I'm not sure what the harm would be, right? Like maybe we'd lose a few statues, but again, maybe we should just refresh all of America's statues every 50 years. But we live in a moment when the Supreme Court, lifetime appointments, the most powerful jurists in the country, many of them, at least the ones in the majority, believe that these founding fathers were perfect, and that all of their judicial decisions are guided by this originalism or textualism that says, what these founders, I know what these founders say. I don't know how they know that, but they claim to, what they were thinking and then guide all of these decisions that they're making based on that. That's troubling to me. And so I welcome a referendum on the founding fathers, if for no other reason than just to puncture their image as these perfect, continuing to guide the governance of this country as if it was sort of proclaimed, to Moses on high. So I'm okay with the slippery slope.
Great. Well, we do have a lot more audience questions now. I do want to ask one more question for myself, though, and I'll get off the track of that I was on. I had a few other things, but how about a compromise? Now, let's talk about compromises, Connor. So what if we keep, and you touched on this, what if we keep the monuments up, but we contextualize them or put them in a historical context, and maybe put a plaque next to it explaining the original intent of the monument. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that, again, the monuments are so clearly in the context of honoring a person that a plaque including, saying, oh, this statue went up in 1905 as the city was implementing, Jim Crow laws and lynching Black Americans. That feels insufficient. And actually, interestingly enough, people who study this are finding that that additional context is actually not very effective. So Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home in Charlottesville, has done this. They have added more context about Sally Hemings, about Jefferson as a slaveholder, about his ideas on race, and they've been doing sort of exit polls from people as they come out of Monticello, and it doesn't make an impact because people go to Monticello because they think Thomas Jefferson is great, and they've made this kind of pilgrimage to his home, and so trying to add in a little bit more context is insufficient because it's like, I think this guy's great. I've come all this way to see his home. Like, that plaque doesn't have much of an impact. No one, I think like 3% of people visiting Monticello as they were doing this study were reevaluating their sense of him at all. So it's insufficient. And also it's just, if you know it's wrong enough to put a plaque up, you should have the courage of your convictions and take the statue down. Because again, I don't know that there's that much harm in the statue coming down, right? Like, we will still be living in the world, in the country that Thomas Jefferson invented, whether or not there's a statue of him. So.
Thanks, Connor. I wanted to give you a couple of hardballs, Connor. There, just playing devil's advocate, folks. Don't.
Oh no, it's great. I think it's a really interesting conversation. I think that's my big takeaway. Is like, let's have the conversations. Right. Let's have these referendums.
All right, so we're going to get Connor out of here at 6:55. We'll give him that's Eastern Standard Time. We'll give him 2 more questions. Kathy asks, should every statue of Robert E. Lee be melted down? I'd like to know your opinion.
Yeah, you could do worse. I think those images from last summer of the graffiti on the Lee statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond, the impromptu basketball court that was set up, people were playing on, they lowered the hoop so that people could dunk on it. The projecting George Floyd's face onto the statue, and now it was just removed recently. I think all of that is incredibly powerful, and it is ideological. Like, I think that we should say that, but we should, I think we should get on side with the ideology that's able to condemn the Confederacy and to fire their monuments honoring them out of a cannon or melting it down or whatever. I think there's a real power in that reclaiming. So I'm all for it.
Lots of great questions here. Francis asks, why haven't descendants of and groups related to Union soldiers been more I can't talk tonight, Connor. Why haven't they fought more against monuments of these treacherous Confederates?
That's a really interesting question. David Blight, who's a terrific historian of the Civil War, has the book that I relied on a lot for understanding this story and drew on it a lot for this book. It's a book called Race and Reunion, and it's about how Americans remember the Civil War. And one of the contentions of Blight's book is that there were two basic projects that needed to happen after the Civil War. The first was the full inclusion of the formerly enslaved, the full inclusion of Black Americans into American democracy, to really create a multiracial democracy. And the second, as any civil war, the task of any civil war is to reunite the two sides, the sort of brother versus brother, the white male soldiers of the war. And it's Blight's argument that you were never going to be able to have both. And that what won out, especially in the first 50 years after the war, was the sectional reconciliation of the white North and the white South. There you see the famous photos from the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg, the two, the Union vets shaking hands with Confederate vets across a fence, and the trickier question was, how do you transform a slave society into a multiracial democracy? But the incentive to reunify the country, to find a way to be sort of brother versus brother, brother in arms instead of brother versus brother, won out. So yeah, I think there could have been, maybe should have been more of that kind of, waving the bloody shirt, as they called it. It's a good question, and I wish there had been more of it, but sadly there wasn't.
All right, watch this segue here. Okay, so on Thursday, November 18th, 7 o'clock, we're hosting Decolonizing, Placing Indigenous People in the Conversation with Debbie Irving and Claudia Foxtree. And I'm going to put information about that program in the chat. And the reason I mention this, last question for you, Connor. Gail asks, what about the Columbus statues that Indigenous people want taken down? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been great too, is that, again, we've been sensitized through years of grassroots organizing and protest work. We've been sensitized to these statues and the issues embodied, the inequities embodied in the Confederate statues, of course, is by no means limited to the Civil War. There's much to be reckoned with, the legacy of colonialism among it. So yeah, I think it's been, and it's been transatlantic too, right? Like folks in England taking down the statues of their colonists too. I think we're really in this moment of reckoning. So yeah, I think they're all of a piece and fit together into a broader context of settler colonialism, really. So I welcome it.
So Connor, wonderful job as expected. Any last words for the group before we wrap up for the night?
I just want to thank you all for being here. I think, like I said, the referendum that we're in right now is really important, and they're difficult conversations, and I think to one degree or another, we're all sort of implicated in them too. So I think having conversations like this can be really important. So thank you all.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Connor, especially. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Pepperell, Lawrence, and Andover. Thank you to the Corning Foundation. Check your emails tomorrow with a link to the survey, a link to the link to the recording, and more information about some upcoming social justice programs. Everyone, have a wonderful night, and go Red Sox. I'm not sure who you're rooting for, Connor, but go Red Sox.
My family's from Massachusetts, and my mom is a diehard Sox fan, so I'm right there with you.
Good answer. All right. Have a great night.
All right. Good night. Thanks.
Bye.